Hey, everybody. Welcome to the I303 podcast, where we share ingenious insights and oddball opinions from the perspective of an IO. Today, I have Alix Prassas with me, and we're going to be talking about big IO. So, as an industry, as a discipline, what does it mean and what can we do? But before we get started too deep into that, Alix, if you would mind sharing a little bit more about yourself and tell us about your origin story.
Sure. So Alix Prassas, I am in Chicago. Been here about 9 years, was in New York City 9 years before that, originally from the Midwest, from Wisconsin. As far as my origin story as it relates to IO psychology, what we're talking about today. So I have always had a strong fascination with people, understanding people, their stories. Now, you might take that and say, like, oh, you must have majored in psychology. No, I actually came to psychology much later. My undergraduate degree was actually a double major in political science and African American studies. Really kind of thinking about that intersection of, individuals with groups, with societal dynamics, was always really interesting to me. Cultural studies. And then my master's degree is actually in African American studies. So, with that, as you might imagine, I'd already kind of fallen into HR, job to have like while I was in school. It was interesting because I never felt like my degrees were separate from the work I did. I always felt like I came from a lens of very strong critical thinking, critical analysis. How are we thinking broadly about the type of workplace, the type of culture we want to have? And within that, how does diversity factor in? How do we think about inclusion? How do we think about equity? My journey is, I've done roles in HR, org design and development, change management, as well as leading DEI. And then as far as consulting, which I've been doing as kind of the main focus for the past couple of years, I really love org design and development and just systems thinking, right? How can we create a system so that everyone who is always so inundated, there's this talk about VUCA world or Bonnie worlds, right? Like, what can help us be more resilient, right? We're only humans. So thinking about the systems that can help with that, right? While also, helping people learn the behaviors that make everything a little bit easier as well. So really love the work that I do across many different types of organizations. I also am currently completing my PhD program in organizational leadership at the Chicago School, and I actually teach in their master's program in IO psychology. So I tried to keep it as brief as possible.
Yeah.
Hopefully, that's a good overview.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so being able to teach in the master's program, I'm sure you get this question all the time. I know for me, I get it all the time. Maybe you can share your perspective in terms of what is IO? So if somebody comes across, what is that? How do you describe that to other people?
Yeah, so I mean it's really just about applying those psychological principles
Yeah.
to work, which I know sounds kind of like you're
Yeah.
using it in the definition. But it's just basically, understanding how human behavior impacts, work settings, and how can we improve both individual and organizational well-being, effectiveness, knowing that. How do we select, develop, assess people? And then how do we design structure, culture, systems that help people and organizations thrive? And I think what makes us really unique in IO is, I feel like we are all, and maybe some people would debate me on this, but we're all
Yeah.
scientist practitioners, or at least we
Hmm.
should be, I think,
Yeah.
right? We don't rely just on intuition on what feels right. We base our recommendations on that kind of rigorous research, data, but we also don't kind of just stay in the
Yeah.
research, right? We're really kind of thinking about how does this land in the real world? How are we thinking about applicability beyond this? We know case studies aren't necessarily generalizable, but
Hmm.
what are those transferable takeaways, right? And just kind of always thinking from that lens.
Gotcha. And from your experience, what have you seen as some potential misconceptions about IO? Maybe something people get wrong.
Yeah, Yeah, so I mean, it's not just kind of like, fancy corporate
Yeah.
HR roles, right? It is, it is a particular type of practice. I think it helps inform a very well functioning HR group, but it is not HR in and of itself. It's not the IO psychologist is not the person that's there to in a layoff, right, decide who gets to go, like, the person with the bad news, that kind of thing. Really good IO work. It protects the employees and
Yeah.
creates better work experience, not from that kind of employee relations standpoint that we think of with
Yeah.
HR, but it's putting in place those systems, putting in place the teachings or recommending at least, right, the teachings and the assessments that will really make sure that there is, a culture that really supports the business strategy as well as the people strategy, right, which should be congruent. Um, and the truth is when, organizations are going to make people decisions, whether IO psychologists are involved or not.
Yeah.
So it's really about, do you want those decisions to be based on gut feelings, bias, outdated practices, or based on science and evidence? So as long as we're doing our jobs, upholding
Yeah.
what IO psychology is, I think that there's a ton of value that we bring to enhance HR, not to replace, but to enhance HR.
Yeah, 100%. And from my experience, one of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to IELTS psychology is, so you must be the person that everybody go to when they're feeling down or when they're, anxious or when they're depressed. It's like, well, not exactly that kind of psychology. So I've been trying to figure out a way in terms of how to reposition IO because intuitively, that just IO in and of itself doesn't really capture what we do. And so I've been working with a couple of other individuals, data scientists, MBAs, and I think we position ourselves somewhere in the middle. So I'm trying this on for size. Curious to hear your thoughts. But I'm curious to hear what IELTS would say if we describe ourselves as people scientists. So, what are your thoughts there? Does that make sense? Is it off base? What do you think?
Well, what's really interesting is there are already companies using that term, right? So, for instance,
Okay.
CultureAmp,
Mm,
their team is called people scientists, right?
okay.
So it's actually already out there in the vernacular.
Yeah.
And they've had that team for years now, at least probably 6 years, maybe longer. CultureAmp folks, don't get at me. Just, I think
There
that's
you
right, or
go.
close to that,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, absolutely. I
Okay.
think I don't know if there's a phrase that's gonna like perfectly kind of like resonate, but I understand where you're coming from on that. I would
Yeah.
say though, as someone who's worked in HR, a lot of HR folks would say they're seen as the therapist. So even though
Okay.
psychology is not in their name,
Yeah.
I'd be hard pressed to find an HR person who hasn't said they're an armchair therapist at least
Gotcha.
once a week, if not every day. So I think it's more about, I mean, I think, yeah, sure. If we want to like rebrand,
Yeah.
do a whole like marketing strategy, I mean, sure. But
Yeah.
I think it is more about all of us just making sure that we are doing right by the field in articulating. And I say that both, those of us literally in the field and then those of us in academics and those of us who bridge, right? Like
Yeah.
making sure that we are accurately describing the things that we do.
Hmm. Yep, 100%. And whether we use IO, whether we use people scientists, for me, the key differentiation between kind of what we do and what HR does is, and feel free to, push back to let me know if I'm off base here. But HR, they tend to be more transactional, more administrative, kind of the day-to-day work. Whereas IOs, we position ourselves more at the strategic level, where it's, we're doing this effort. What's the best practice and how do we quantify the impact and effectiveness of, let's say we're going to do this new recruiting strategy or this new assessment strategy or this new learning and development strategy, et cetera, et cetera. So we, to your point, view it almost from a systems perspective rather than the transactional perspective. Would that be a fair way to kind of differentiate what we do from
So it's
HR?
interesting
Yep.
because there's a huge debate in the HR world. I mean, I
Okay.
think a lot of you might have some HR leaders kind of like yelling at
Yeah,
or
yeah,
yelling at their phone right now
yeah.
because we're always making the case that, HR's role is to be strategic, like the chief people officer, right? Like really making sure that they are thinking through that, through that lens. And that's what,
Hmm.
with IO psychology, right? Sometimes I think with the right HR person. It's almost like a lens for the work that they do, right? I think there are some kind of good differentiations that would make sense depending upon the organization. I work with a lot of small to medium sized businesses, right? Like it
Okay.
doesn't make sense to have an in-house dedicated IO psychologist. But, when I'm working with clients, right, like my job is to, teach them to fish, so to speak, right? Like teach them to kind of understand some of these principles so they can
Hmm.
apply them. Because really, I would say HR of today, at least it's supposed to be,
Yeah.
right? It is supposed to be having that really forward thinking, underneath the people strategy, right? The, workforce planning strategy.
Hmm.
It is thinking about, I mean, hiring is always
Yeah.
a really interesting conversation. And how do you hire strategically? And that's where, too, yeah, it makes sense. You bring in kind of an IO psychologist at the start to assess, okay, let's identify the gaps here, and then really like put you on the footing, HR leader, to be able to handle all these things yourself. Now, again, I work with SMBs. I think in larger companies, right, I think that may resonate more what you're saying. But my hope is that even HR moves to being much more transformational and strategic.
Gotcha. And real quick, what's SMB? What does that mean again?
I'm so sorry, small to
Yep.
medium sized businesses.
Gotcha. Perfect.
Yes.
And so I'm glad you shared kind of being more analytical, more thoughtful in terms of what are the tasks and what are the potential skills needed to successfully perform in the workplace. I think with the advent of AI, that lens, that approach, that perspective is going to be absolutely critical. Because to your point, when it comes to workforce planning, we have this entire different type of employee, if you will, where they're, silicon instead of carbon. So they're, I don't even know if it's ones and zeros. It might be something way beyond that. But essentially, from a workforce perspective, should a person be doing this, or should some kind of AI, automation, robotics be doing this, or even to what level is this organization going to incorporate that? And so I think we're uniquely positioned to help guide or lead what that's going to look like. What are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. And I
Okay.
think that if there is anyone who has been severely left out of the AI conversation, it's IO psychologists, right? HR is getting brought in, but they're
Yeah.
kind of a bit tied between, legal saying we can't do this. They know people are already using it, right? And executives just kind of making decisions wholesale without
Hmm.
actually thinking through it strategically, right?
Yeah.
So, a great example of where IO psychology is really going to, have that added value is before you make a blanket decision around how, where we use AI, especially as it comes to whether we hire someone to do this or don't hire someone to do this, you should be looking at all of your roles and doing a complete assessment of all of your current roles, right? And actually, while you're at it, you should
Yeah.
really be looking at how they match or don't match your growth strategy, right? Because that
Yeah.
should always be in alignment. So I think that's a key piece, right? And that may impact the design of your entire organization, right? Not just the people you hire, it may especially impact your leadership team, right?
Yeah.
And are we actually doing the work to understand what are the implications, at a base level, right? Kind of change impact by stakeholder group. What are the implications if we replace this, right?
Hmm.
Do we, for instance, a client who, maybe they're in, maybe middle of America, right? And they are used to their clients want that personal interaction.
Yeah.
It's not that they can never move to something more technical, but there's got to be a whole journey with that,
Yeah.
right? Like, have you even mapped your customer journey, your employee
Hmm.
journey, right? Like all of these things that are foundational before you can make those very big decisions. That's where IO psychology can add that value. And the thing
Yeah.
is, too, AI is, where it excels at pattern recognition, right? In
Hmm.
large data sets. So, potentially better predictive models for like turnover, performance, engagement. Um, However, it needs our
Yeah.
expertise to be effective,
Yeah.
right? So, I like to call, things like ChatGPT, right? And really just kind of that open source, or just, really just that generative AI, I should
Hmm.
say, as groupthink bias at scale, right?
Yeah.
So who is actually going through and discerning whether the information is any good that's coming from, now that's just generative, right? I know we
Yeah.
use AI far beyond that, but there has to be measures, controls, protocols in
Yeah.
place. And, it needs to be clear to people that like this is going to be a journey, right? We're going to be testing out some things. We're going to ask for your help in actually doing some of this. So that's a great way to get buy-in, because when you're not hearing from people and then suddenly you see a news story about organizations that are
Yeah.
replacing people with AI, what if, and actually, if you're doing it right, really nobody should lose their job just changes. Now, if they decide that change is not for them, best of luck to them, right? That's great because then they get to decide that. But we really should be thinking about how are we giving people more meaningful work based upon how we can use AI. So kind of taking out the stuff that a lot of people don't even really like to do anyway, and focusing on, the critical thinking, the
Hmm.
judgment, hopefully good judgment,
Yeah.
and the, interpersonal interaction that AI can't replace in the same way.
Yep, gotcha, definitely. And so, to your point, I think IOs definitely need to have a seat at the table. I've actually got a personal experience, so I'm going to share a little bit more, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. And so, in my past, I was working with an organization. I'm not going to call them out, but I was working with an organization, and they were piloting asynchronous interviewing with this new hiring platform. They wanted to see if it would be predictive of future employee performance. And so they already had kind of a model or an ideal candidate in terms of these are the characteristics we want to see in the video, fed it into the AI. And so it was able to identify based on, these characteristics, other individuals who mirror those characteristics would quote unquote be successful hires. And so same questions, same recording, everyone had the same experience. And until I got there, the team didn't recognize that it was being biased in recommending who should continue in the process. Here's what I mean by that. One of the data points that was identified as a predictor of success was the level of eye contact candidates had with the camera. And as you can imagine, that can have very big differences culturally, where in some cultures, in some backgrounds, making direct eye contact is viewed as disrespectful. And so I'm going to position this out there just out of curiosity from your experience. What cultures would you say eye contact is viewed as, if you make direct eye contact, disrespectful, whereas if you don't, it's viewed as very deferential, very respectful? Just from your experience, if you had a guess, which ones do you think?
Well, I would actually broaden that to
Sure.
say, how are you thinking about neurodivergence?
There you
Right?
go. That's
Like
another, yep.
how are you thinking about a comfortable working environment? And I get there may be roles where, yeah, like you do need to be on camera, right? But I think there needs to be, every time we say this has to be a particular skill or trait of a person, always challenge ourselves, even when it's, for instance, like years of experience, right? Okay, what are you going to get out of someone who has those exact years of experience?
Right.
Let's
Yep.
home in on that behavior versus
Hmm.
that. Now, when it comes to eye contact, right? So, this you're really testing me. I can't remember
And so, yeah,
offhand.
I'm just throwing it out there. If
Um,
not, I can
I'm sure
share.
my students are schooling me right
Yeah.
now because I
Yeah.
teach a course related to this, but I'm not remembering offhand. But absolutely, yeah, and that's would recommend, Aaron Meyer's The Culture Map, like, some of those that can give you a little bit more insight on that. Um, but absolutely, and especially I think of it in terms of kind of like the power distance, right? And like
You're on the
who
right
has
track.
more
Yep. Yep.
authority
Hmm.
and what it means to make, direct eye contact with someone
Hmm.
who has authority. So I think again, it's reassessing. It actually kind of harkens back to, in the early days of using AI for resume screening. And this is like a known case study, so I'm not bursting Amazon's bubble here. Basically what happened was, Amazon tried this and their first iteration. I'm not saying it's still like this, but their first iteration, even though it gave like kind of very clear objective like criteria for who is going to excel and it had blind resumes, it still found a way to filter out, I think it was like 98 or 99% of women who applied.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, so it's something that you've always got to really examine. And even talking to a lot of like, AI experts, they'll be the first to say this type of thing should never be used for more specialized role, like, AI screening, any of that. It really should be used for kind of those like bulk, where you're hiring many different people into one position and you do need kind of that set of criteria that makes it a little bit more useful. But the other thing is that we always need to keep in mind that just because people to date have fit this particular background of what's successful,
Hmm.
that's still not all the information, right? And that's where you really need that combination of quantitative and qualitative, that rich description.
Yep.
And also, what got you here won't necessarily get you there. You think of how much technology has changed.
Hmm.
I'd imagine there's some roles that the background of someone who was a great fit 10 years ago has nothing to do with the background of someone who's a great fit now, right? And roles are always changing and evolving. What I'm not saying is we need to throw this out entirely, but again, we need to critically analyze the why behind any time we introduce any new tool, how we're using AI. And I think, too, for all the organizations that are very big on their commitments, kind of the green commitments, right, to environment, how are you offsetting the incredible damage that generative AI in particular, right? Like, does, where those centers are, how much energy they use, the clean water that's being used because of it. So, I think there's just a lot of considerations that give us pause to make sure that we're doing this correctly.
100%. And you were definitely on the right path when it came to power distance. And so, interestingly enough, the organization or the vendor we were using shared their results in terms of this first round of, 5,000 plus individuals who went through this process. It started to filter out individuals who it would predict would be successful versus not successful. We started noticing differences based on individuals who identify or who had claimed to have a background from Latin America. So, me being Mexican American, power distance is definitely a big thing. Traditionally, I'm not saying this is always the case, but traditionally, we're uncomfortable questioning authority. That this is what's been given to us, this is what we're told, and we just go out and do it. And so it started to differentiate individuals. And so as a result of that, more often than not, Mexican Americans, people with, Latin American backgrounds, they struggle to make direct eye contact with the camera because that's viewed as disrespectful. And so it started to differentiate. Well, this group of individuals is not making as much eye contact, so their likelihood of success on the job is less compared to individuals who make more eye contact directly with the camera. And unless an IO was there, they would have just taken it, or I'm not saying they would have, but the probability that an HR department would have just taken it at face value, well, the AI is recommending these individuals continue. Let's just have them continue without stopping and saying, well, why is there a difference? What is the major difference between their performance? Is it just eye contact? Are they saying similar things? Are they responding in similar ways? So without an IO taking that deep dive, I think that's where our skill set is critical to make sure HR doesn't, what's the word that I'm looking for? Engage in something they shouldn't.
Yeah, and I would even say also on the flip side is there are a lot of managers, a lot of,
Yeah.
HR folk, people across the board that are like, data can never tell me this is a good hire, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
again, not saying we don't need these criteria, but you need to be skilled in what these criteria really mean and how to interpret them in a fair way.
100%. And so that I think is a great segue to kind of our next topic here. And so we're looking at big IO. And when I think of big IO or kind of the broader industry, for me, it kind of breaks down into a couple of big buckets. And I'm wondering if we could maybe tap dance a little in each area. Otherwise, we'll be here, hours upon hours upon hours.
Right.
But I'm thinking in following the employee life cycle, IO really plays in kind of the recruiting slash assessment world, the
Hmm.
learning and development world, and the performance management evaluation, maybe even employee engagement world. Would you say that's a fair kind of overview of the big buckets we play in? Is there anything else you would add to that?
Yeah, so let me permission to kind of talk
Yep,
through
yep,
this here,
of
right? So,
course.
okay, so yes, so from the hiring standpoint and even pre-hiring, right? Strategic workforce planning, so things like job analysis.
Hmm.
Now, kind of presiding over all of this is you need a strong competency model,
Hmm.
right?
So let me pause right there. For those who aren't as familiar with job analysis versus competencies or competency modeling, what do you see as the differences or the similarities between those two concepts?
Yeah, so competency model, the way I like to describe it, it's your values in practice.
Mm-hmm.
Like those should be directly aligned. Now, there are nuances for each role, right? And you should have kind of a leadership competency model. All of those things are going to be organization specific, industry, culture, all of those different things. But it's really just the behaviors that
Gotcha.
show up. And that should all be in alignment. So if you've ever heard the term high performance work system, what that's referencing is actually that everything's in alignment with, the context of the organization. So growth strategy, culture, all of those things are in harmony, with what's going to make them successful, right? So again, competency model, think of it like, values in practice,
Gotcha.
right? And if you don't have, like, you shouldn't even have values. Like if you haven't articulated what they are in practice, then those shouldn't be separate by any means, the values and competency model. Okay. For job analysis, what we're really doing there is we are evaluating what should, the responsibilities, knowledge, skills, abilities, how does that all come together and result is usually a job description, right? But it is a really in-depth analysis that's, not just thinking about, kind of interviews with people in that actual organization, but also benchmarking against, industry insights, regional, right? There's so many kind of context specific things that are important. So that's what we're talking about with job analysis. Was that helpful?
It was definitely. And so I didn't mean to take away, but for those who aren't familiar, I'm glad you're able to share that. So coming back into your conversation, so we have job analysis, competencies, they feed the employee life cycle. Did mean to
Yeah.
interrupt, but
So
let's,
kind
yeah,
of just thinking from start to finish, right? So you've
yeah,
got
yeah.
you've got your competency model. From there, you can kind of, do that job analysis. Sometimes you can do them simultaneously, right? Now, the interviews itself, right? No matter how many, whatever assessments you have, you should always have structured interviewing. The research is overwhelming, right? Especially when you talk about avoiding bias, like, if that is what you focus on, like I said, whether you use assessments or not,
Mhm.
focus on structured interviews. That's going to be really key. And that's an insight, that comes from IO psychology.
Real quick,
Um,
also, Alex, what's the difference between structured versus non-structured or
yeah,
just an interview? So,
yeah.
yeah,
So it's just like it sounds, right?
yeah.
So structured, you're going to be asking the same questions. And I promise you, as someone who's interviewed many people, it does not have to be robotic, right? Like I always hated being in interviews where someone was like, "Tell me about a time when," like reading off a
Yeah,
sheet. It doesn't
yeah,
have to be that, right? But you do want to make sure that, everyone's getting asked the same questions to the point about values, competencies, right? Like you want to get specific answers
yeah.
about how they go about things, right? So that's where, even if it's structured, right, you can probe, right? So you can, kind of insert questions to get clarity. Like I said, it's really just making sure there's consistency that everyone's kind of gotten the opportunity to answer the same questions. Unstructured, obviously, being just kind of like willy nilly. And then, so that's kind of when I'm thinking about like the hiring piece of it. There is obviously, throughout the course, there's employee engagement, right? Where, you know, organizations do it correctly, right? They're only surveying as much as they can take action, and they are
Hmm.
having, several kind of points, several connection points throughout the duration between surveys to connect actions to the insights found, right? And I think it's also important after each engagement survey to talk about what you're not able to do right now. People aren't expecting you to do all the things they're mentioning. What they're expecting is that they're heard,
Hmm.
right? So there are even tools where the employee can, stay anonymous, but the manager, whoever has access to that report, right, they can actually ask clarifying questions. And there are times like I took advantage of that as a leader. I took advantage of that at an organization, and I can tell you how many times people were like, "Oh my gosh, someone read this." Oh,
Yeah.
like like that alone was enough for them to feel better, right? Not that I just left it at that, but like think about what are the tools you have to engage throughout. So that's kind of a key piece, or just pulse surveys, focus groups. Anytime you're gathering feedback, you should be using IO principles, right? 360-degree feedback.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's done awfully in a lot of companies, and that is where I highly encourage, if you're going to use it at all,
Yeah.
engage an expert. It should absolutely be development focused, and it should be like you should have a whole kind of communications plan around it, like how you're going to roll out, what do those conversations look like, what are managers going to do with it, and it also needs to be right for your culture. If you have not gotten your culture to a place that you're really a feedback culture, right? That
Hmm.
people know how to give constructive feedback. There's candor. The 360 feedback can really backfire,
Yeah.
right? So again, like if you're kind of thinking about all the things you need to do, always focus on having foundations of culture before you kind of move to the next thing. I think about, with performance management, like 9 box placement, right?
Hmm.
Like having informed conversations about you know, what does it really mean for someone to
Yeah.
be in this box versus that box? Actually having the research behind potential. Because
Hmm.
we all know that, potential, like an easy example is that, men are seen for their potential, women are seen for their performance, right? So,
Yeah.
kind of if everyone starts here, every time, a man does something well, he just goes up a notch, right? Now, every time a woman does one thing wrong, she goes down a notch, right? So it's just, it's kind of setting things up that the performance evaluation isn't done as well. And again, that's just, general research, right? Of course, that doesn't mean everyone does it that way. But you want to make sure that you have evidence-based performance management. So having that continuous feedback, having everything align with goals, having the right development conversations. Do not throw out performance reviews. People want to know where they stand. They just want them done better. So that's a really key piece, is the performance management side of things. And that's something I honestly is a huge topic with a lot of my clients, is how do we do performance management right? How do we do career growth right? That can also be something that can be really well informed by an expert. Career development, having those separate conversations from performance management. Um, I think exit interviews, there's a lot of
Hmm.
gripes around exit interviews, but I do think there is a way to make them a bit more useful, right? I think that's where you need someone who's really trained in how to do those. And, what are you doing with those themes? How are you addressing them? How do they kind of fit into the overall strategy? The goal, though, is that nothing is a surprise in the exit interview, right? If you're doing things right,
Yeah.
that person will have felt comfortable to bring up things along the way, right? Um, and those are kind of some of the biggest things. The only other thing I would add is really, so beyond even the engagement pulse surveys, is that organizational network analysis, right? So like understanding how the work actually flows through the kind of informal networks, not just the org chart. And that's a really key piece for any, especially leading any type of change, right? Really understanding that and drilling into that. And influence can be positive or negative, right? So you really have to tap into, like how do we leverage people, how do we determine which side they're on, and how do we
Yeah.
leverage them accordingly? Because the fact is, for instance, they're the type of people, if they leave, probably going to bring several people with them, right? And that doesn't, this isn't to be interpreted as we're just going to cater to everything they do or say, but it's really important to understand that nuance.
Gotcha. And so yeah, there's definitely a lot you talked about there. So there's a couple I want to pull out and get your thoughts on. So when it comes to engagement, my experience has been in the past when I bring this up to business leaders or individuals hiring the organization closer to the C-suite. One of the questions I've gotten, and I'm curious to hear how you've approached this, is why should we care about engagement? They're just an employee, they're just like any other resource. What's the benefit of it? And so, not saying you have, but if you were to have gotten that pushback or that feedback, what would be your counter, or what would be your, I guess, rebuttal in that case?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the thing is that most of the people who say that don't really care about whatever stats you put in front of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they have a
Yeah.
mentality of, No, 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 no. Nobody, when I was coming up in work, like nobody cared about,
Yeah, yeah.
you know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
I'm here to get a paycheck. And the thing is that let's think about productivity, which impacts the bottom line.
Yeah. I like it. I
We
like
really
where you're
don't
going.
care about this word engagement, right? And I get, sometimes we use words to the point that nobody even knows what they mean anymore, right?
Yeah.
So, if you think about productivity, think about yourself, right? When are you at your most productive? Is it when you hate what you're doing?
Yeah, yeah,
Or is it when you love what you're doing?
yeah,
I'm gonna guess it's probably, probably more towards love, right?
yeah,
And we don't even need everyone to love what they do every single day.
yeah,
However, if we can engage them around kind of a common goal, right? If there's a purpose orientation we can have, um, if we can bring together teams in a way that, that we develop that camaraderie and doesn't at all mean, happy hours
yeah,
and, some of the kind of like stereotypical things,
yeah.
because those can actually be exclusionary a lot of
Hmm.
times. It's just when you have a better place to work, it also shows in how they treat customers, right? So if you're a B2C or business to consumer organization, right? Like, again, if you hate your work, it's probably going to show in how you interact with customers.
Yeah.
And like I said, there is a ton of research out there,
Hmm.
right? I mean, I'm sure I could pull up, several different stats, right? But when someone comes with that, I can almost guarantee like they're only going to be moved by like a strong anecdote versus let me show you a bunch of stats about why this works.
Yeah, 100%. And it sounds as though you and I are in alignment. So similar to your explanation, but instead of using one person, I use the entire organization. So if business leader, executive were to, or when they have pushback on me with that feedback, I say, imagine we have an organization where 100% of the employees are fully engaged. Now imagine we make an exact copy, Control C, Control V of the exact same organization with the exact same employees, but they are not engaged at all. Everything else is exactly the same. Same number of employees, same expectations, same desired outcomes. Which one do we believe will outperform the other? The one where the employees are fully engaged or the one where they're not engaged at all? And of course, sharing it that way, it's like, well, that kind of makes sense because it'll benefit, to your point, productivity, but I'm sure it benefits a whole bunch of other attributes as well. And so
Yeah.
it sounds as though you and I are in alignment there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Okay. So the next thing, and when you were providing the overview of the IO field, you shared the 360 evaluation needs to be in alignment with the culture. I agree 10,000%. What I'm curious to get your thoughts on is what do you see as the potential pitfalls or the potential issues that can arise if the 360 evaluation is placed, but it does not align with the organizational culture? What do you think can go wrong?
Yeah, I mean that's essentially like just Yelp review in an
Yeah.
organization, right? Where like people
Yeah.
only respond if they have very strong feelings either way. So you could get back, as a leader, right? You could get back a report where like half the responses are, "Oh my God, this is like the second coming of some prophet." You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the other half are, "I hate this person, they're the
Yeah.
devil." You know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
you really like need to make sure you're setting the stage, and that's where, yeah, like if you've got kind of that history of having that psychological safety, where people in psychological safety, right, just level set, people feel comfortable taking those risks, and risks
Yeah.
can be something like speaking up, right?
Hmm.
And so that piece of it, or if nothing else, like let's say you're kind of trying to do it all at the same time. You're revamping the culture, but like you really feel strongly that this is going to be something that's going to be impactful. Or like, it's really about maybe, maybe you're just focused on the leadership team. It's like, they need a dose of reality kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's all about the communication, right? To say like, yes, you're anonymous, but we're still a professional environment. Please make sure that it is constructive. If it's not constructive, it's not helpful, right? And it'll be thrown out, and
Yeah.
kind of just kind of like, like putting that out there. So I think that's a key piece because it can be so demoralizing.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember my first ever 360, because I really interacted. I mean, this was 10 or so years ago. I really interacted with everyone in the company. I pretty much said, I checked the box on pretty much
Yeah.
everyone in the
Yeah.
company, right? send it to everybody. And that was kind of my feedback, right? Some were like, oh my God, she's so amazing.
Yeah.
She's too outspoken, she's
Yeah.
too
Yeah.
blunt, she's too direct, she's kind of a jerk. Like, it's like, ugh, like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
when you first read it, even if you think you're like tough as nails, like everyone's human and going to have a reaction, right? And it can be a bit demoralizing.
Yeah.
So making sure before they even see it, like they're not just like given the report, someone's actually meeting with them
Yeah.
and go over it in a constructive way and to kind of ask the questions of like, where do you think this might be coming from? Because otherwise, what's also going to happen is you got kind of the emotional piece, but it's also going to be like, oh, I know exactly who said this statement. Or they're going to try to find who said it. And that is not the purpose
Yeah.
of a
Yeah.
360. So, really just making sure, however you do it, if you do it, that you are thinking of as much as you can how it's actually going to play out in your organization.
Yeah, 100%. And to your point, I like that you shared that it should be predominantly developmental rather than evaluative, where we're,
Absolutely.
yeah, making those, promotion decisions or those pay increase decisions. I'm not sure if that's the best use of a 360 because that's where I think
Yeah,
things can get a little political. That's where things,
absolutely not. Yeah.
kind of get
Yeah.
off the rails a little bit.
Yeah. Everybody don't do that. It's solely that developmental tool, just like we talked about with assessments in
Yeah,
general, right?
yeah,
To
yeah,
me, I see it as one more assessment. It's just another tool in your toolbox. Okay, this is a great way to get crowdsourced feedback, and what's the saying? Like, take what's useful, disregard the rest, kind of
yeah,
thing,
yeah,
but to know that, that's where you need to
yeah,
sit with someone who's an expert and knows how to interpret that report. It can
yeah,
really talk through what's going to be useful, what you can take away from it. Because even kind of the meanest comments,
yeah,
there's something there that you
yeah,
can take away from it. And as someone who, like it was in a role that was highly visible, right? So people always had something to say. I
yeah,
really challenged myself. I'm not saying I did it right every time, but really challenged myself to say, like, even though that was a mean personal attack, like what's behind that, right?
yeah.
Like where's that coming from and how might I use that information to still improve?
Yeah, and to your point, it's definitely a shot at the ego. So, like you, I remember my first 360, and it was hard to separate. To your point, they're telling me this feedback. How do I not take it personally, but at the same time also extract out? They're trying to give me something here. So, how
Yeah.
can I manage all of that to still hear, okay, I may not necessarily agree, or, I think this person's an a-hole, or whatever the case may be. Stop with that, extract out the important information, and then say, okay, how can I get better moving forward? So,
Oh,
definitely a shot at the ego. So another thing you shared when it comes to IO as a bigger field, and I think this is an HR general, it seems as though we keep swinging back and forth on the pendulum when it comes to performance evaluations. I remember at one point they were all the rage, everyone does it. Then it swung back the other way where, you know what, we're this new organization, we're, hip, we're forward facing, we're going to remove evaluations altogether. So, two-part question. One is, where do you think we are in terms of that pendulum swing? And do you lean one way or another? And why?
yeah. So I think, we are back to yes, we need performance reviews. And there's been
Yeah.
studies on that. There was one that had Adam Grant, maybe a couple other
Okay.
people that are like, look, don't throw it all away, right? Namely because otherwise, how do we really let people know
Correct.
kind
Yeah.
of where they stand? We might think we have the most clear conversations
Yeah.
as managers, as someone who coaches managers and also has also been a manager. Like I no, I swear I know I said
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even the same email you both interpret it differently, right? So just like knowing where you stand. But again, with those performance evaluations, make sure you crowdsource that feedback, right?
Mhm.
So I think we're there. However, I think we all agree, even though most organizations in practice still do this, I
Yeah.
think for the most part, we agree, we know it needs to be more than annual, right? But I think there's maybe kind of a toss up between what that looks like. Is it maybe like kind of a semi-formal, or is it just reinforcing the need for a check-in every
Yeah.
month, right? A lot of performance management tools are really getting really good at kind of having, something you can go to that is like, giving feedback, in a regular cadence directly on their performance evaluation form, right? So they can kind of constantly just see the evolution. So
Yeah.
use tools, right, in the way they should be used. I think that's really helpful. And I think too, it is how are you effectively balancing the task performance and the contextual performance, right? So, below manager level, yeah, it's probably in a way a little bit more on task, right? But once you get to the manager level, that
Yeah.
should that should really be kind of a much smaller piece of it. It really should be that contextual piece. And maybe even that level like right before, right? Kind of gearing people up to be manager, but what I mean by that, right? So just to level set again,
Yeah.
task performance, how well someone executes, a particular thing that they're supposed to execute. And then contextual, what I'm talking about there is, how are they demonstrating the values? How are
Hmm.
they fulfilling that competency model, right? If you've ever heard the term citizenship behaviors, it's really about, people going above and beyond for the organization. That should absolutely be recognized. And then also adaptive performance. So handling change and uncertainty. And that's a competency that really we should be evaluating at every level, though, especially, at the kind of manager and above levels, because that's such a critical piece of of resilience, right?
Yeah.
And being able to grow. Because if you constantly feel like you're underwater, how can you get
Yeah.
to that growth place? And I think it also opens up a conversation around how is the organization supporting you in that? So I'm doing my research is based in building trust in diverse teams, and I interviewed this person who said, at performance evaluation time, he sees it as the not that not just that the person does a self-assessment, but they do a performance review of the organization at that time too,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like they weren't able to execute on XYZ. Well, are we missing tools that we really need to be successful? That's where you get in that enablement piece.
Yeah.
Are you facing obstacles? Like there's times too, I don't even realize as a manager that I'm being the obstacle in the process, right? So like what are
Yeah.
roadblocks that you're encountering? So, making sure that you really have that space for that full conversation. So that's kind of, when we're thinking about the performance evaluation itself, I think also we need to factor in just how biased,
Yeah.
all the bias thinking can creep into it. Not the least of which is idiosyncratic rater bias,
Hmm.
which tells us that, what a manager rates an employee has more to do with the manager than with the employee. So, for instance, if the manager is really terrible at I don't know, communication. I mean, hopefully they're
Yeah.
not, but
Yeah.
terrible at
Yeah.
communication and their employee is really good at it, they're going to score them that much higher. However, if the manager is really excellent at, say, some technical thing, right? They're really excellent at that, and maybe that person's not as good at that. They're going to rate them that much lower, right? And then you've got kind of the sibling contrast error where like they're comparing team members against the
Yeah.
other versus comparing against a baseline, right? So that's where things like from the IO psychology world, bars or behaviorally anchored rating scales, like all of those things are really critical. Having very clear descriptions of
Hmm.
what does this look like at practice when you meet expectations, exceed, and don't meet expectations, right? So the
Yeah.
more clarity we can provide, the better experience for everyone all around.
Yep. And I agree 10,000% with everything you just shared. So I agree. I've always been a fan of, I think we do still need to have performance evaluations because it's hard, to your point, how do we come up with a baseline or how do we try to remain objective if we have nothing to rate it against, meaning this is typical or this is what we identify as typical, this is what we identify as high performing. If that's not written, to your point, different individuals are going to interpret performance very differently. And so I've always been a fan of, okay, more than annual, should be more structured. But to your point, it's in terms of anything above and beyond that, it's going to be nuanced to each organization, each culture. But I do agree there should be that evaluation, that more objective, that baseline, if you will.
Yeah. And I think so, overall, if I could kind of summarize,
Yep.
improving performance measurement, right? So thinking about multiple measures, thinking about calibration, right? So that way, like leaders coming together and encourage it to be like a diverse panel, like across the
Yep.
organization, right? Multiple raters, crowdsourced feedback, clear behavioral anchors, and those regular calibration discussions. So, it's don't throw the baby out with the bathwater,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
it's how are we thinking about, to your point, like how it makes sense for our particular organization, And also, what is kind of the stopgap? Because maybe I'm doing nothing right now, so you got
Yeah,
to
yeah,
start somewhere.
yeah.
And then it's like, okay, what do we want to work towards and make sure that we have milestones along the way to get there?
Gotcha. All right, transitioning now a little bit. So we're going to take a little bit of a hard left, if you will. So we talked about some of the best practices, some of the approaches that IO can bring to optimize how individuals interact, engage, and actually do their work at work. When it comes to IO, is there anything you disagree with or anything you think IO has an opportunity to do differently or potentially better?
Yeah, I mean, I'm someone who thinks, everyone can do better, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah,
just
yeah.
in general. So I think, are we always are we always clear on what actually matters? So like, validity,
Hmm.
right? So we talked earlier about like, okay, that was the profile for 1999.
Yeah.
Are we consistently like analyzing, right? And are we so focused on reliability that we're kind of like losing the prime time to like do this, right? So like are we so focused on that we're just not doing anything? Or by the time we have that with the way that roles change so much,
Hmm.
so I think, just the concepts around reliability and validity, are something that can be kind of an ongoing discussion.
Yeah.
I think, when it comes to organizational culture, right? So we've got all these different frameworks. I firmly believe, and I'm grateful that I'm in a program that's very, scholar practitioner focused. So, always that balance that, like I always tell my students, like you're always going to use multiple
Yeah.
methodologies, right? Like it should always be tailored, and sometimes even in the same organization, right? You're going to use a little bit of Sheen, you're going to use a little bit of, kind of the OCAI, like what makes sense for obviously what you're most what you
Yeah.
understand the most and
Yeah.
feel comfortable speaking to, but more broadly, right? Like, what makes sense for this particular organization, and what am I going to be able to explain in a way that's going to resonate, right? And if you're working with a very scientific engineering organization, right, like you
Yeah.
may get like, a little bit more into the very like specifics of the framework, whereas one that's quite opposite of that wouldn't kind of see it the same way. So I think that's another piece. Over reliance on self-report
Mm-hmm.
measures. I even think about, just the whole concept of a lot of the research around leadership effectiveness and how many things are based on like a self
Yeah. Too many, if you ask me. Yeah.
assessment. And I'm like,
Yeah.
hold up. Like
Yeah.
there's times like I was filling out like an assessment like the other day and I'm like, I actually changed some of my answers just because I was
Yeah.
worried they would think that I thought I was
Yeah.
perfect. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're not gonna like
Yeah.
believe me if I like answer it this way. So, I would want other people kind of like factoring in. So kind of thinking about, and that may also just be the types of assessment you use, but I just think, like that's something to always be taken into consideration. So again, it doesn't mean you throw it all away, but it's another consideration. And then kind of relieve that like academic practitioner divide. I have qualms kind of on both sides, talking with academics, right? We get so
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
our, and this is far beyond IO psychology. This is
Yeah.
kind of like academic world in
Yeah.
general. It's like, oh, all the research right here. Like, why don't they just follow it? Like, what is wrong with them? Right. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, have you worked a day in corporate America?
Yeah.
Because I can
Yeah.
guarantee you'd have a different lens. And then on the business side, it's like, ooh, shiny object. Oh, but
Yeah.
I heard this best practice
Yeah.
from, whoever the leader of the minute is,
Yeah.
right? Like, well, hold up. Like, that has kind of nothing to do with anything outside of their own purview. And then we also even have, books that are considered kind of like scholarly books that are just like one man who happened to be a successful consultant just talking about everything he did. And it's like, well, hold up. Like, so kind of the lack of diversity across all that. So it's, we just want to make sure that we're constantly challenging ourselves
Yeah.
to operate at, a higher level. And I think alongside that, embracing new technologies and really being able to, we should be able to consult on, the HR technologies, right? Like that should be something in our wheelhouse. Not that we need to know or know the back end of every single technology, but we need to understand how it can elevate or be a detriment to these systems that you put in place. Because even when you say system, the leaders are automatically go to a technology system. So even just explaining that, but all of that has to be in alignment to truly have that high performance work system.
Yeah, 100%. When it comes to IO best practices and things we see where IO can get a little bit better, I was definitely in alignment. When it comes to, I think we focus way I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I do agree reliability and validity are top of mind when it comes to individuals who work in IO, but everyone else who doesn't, which is basically the rest of the business, they don't really care as much about it. And so have you experienced something similar? Oh,
Well, and I think it's also that they don't necessarily know
that's a good
exactly
point.
what it means. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
before I was in this world, I didn't necessarily know. It's like you could, context clues, you could kind of figure it out, but you didn't know like what that actually looked like. Right? Like reliability, when the average person thinks of reliability, oh, I can rely on a person. The word that comes to mind isn't necessarily right away consistency, right? Some people it does, but some
Yeah.
people it doesn't. So I think it's, part of it's just an educational piece about what
Yeah.
we mean by reliability and validity and the
Hmm.
importance of those. And I mean, the fact is that there are companies using assessments that don't have either, and that's
Yeah.
obviously a problem,
Yeah.
right? So, but to me, that's on us for that education gap. So, like making sure that that is something that we are constantly kind of bringing back to, but with, from an educational standpoint, but not from a standpoint of it's the end all be all. Because to my point earlier, we can't
Yeah.
just wait to have all the
Hmm.
data. Like when as fast as things are changing,
Yeah.
like I've worked with a lot of, tech companies or like more startups or kind of like just past the startup phase. I mean, we're rolling out stuff every day,
Yeah.
so we kind of have to work with good enough from that data perspective with a commitment to continue to monitor and measure, right? But I mean, if we can even just get organizations to have, a very clear definition of the problem
Hmm.
and success metrics in alignment with that and embedded into and making sure all the tools support all of that. I mean, I think
Yeah.
even that's a win, right? And I do feel like that will trickle down and help them start to develop the habits to make sure that we are looking for this kind of scientific backing behind the things that we're doing.
100%. And I think where IOs struggle a little bit is they overly focus on reliability and validity without developing the chain of evidence as to if we are reliable and we are valid, it helps us realize our business, our team, our division, our department goals. I
Yeah.
think that leap or that connection we either overlook or, for whatever reason, don't take it into account.
Yeah. And that without saying it's the end all be all.
There you go. Yeah, I
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah. The
Perfect.
nuanced conversation around it.
Yep. And so another thing you shared is when it comes to organizational culture, and I would even add leadership into this. I think we have way too many frameworks, way too many definitions where it can theoretically spiral, out of control. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. So what I like about clinical psychology is they have the big five when it comes to personality traits, where there's all kinds of models, all kinds of frameworks, but eventually they all kind of are subsumed by the big five. Do you think
Yeah.
that's something IO can do when it comes to leadership and or organizational culture?
So that's really interesting. So when I think about why the Big Five is so popular, it's, a huge piece is that it has been the most validated, right? But again, it has its shortcomings too. And actually, I think of it in terms of, anytime we get into a monopoly, I get worried, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I understand that kind of desire to like, let's have a common language, right? Like, let's try to like, make sure that we all understand this in the same way. Like, I think it's so powerful to have multiple frameworks, but I think what it is how do we pull that together and make sense of when you might use this framework versus that framework, and how do we make sure that the noise from the frameworks that aren't
Yeah.
academically backed,
Yeah.
right? That like, I mean, because let's be honest, as a consultant, we have our own
Mm-hmm.
methodologies. I'm not going to go out there and tell people it's an academic framework,
Yeah.
right? But it is a methodology, right? And it's based on, case studies, right? At our organization, I'm grateful that we really do have that IO psychology lens. Anything we do, even if it's new, it's validated by decades of research. Um, but, and that's where PSYOP comes in, right?
Yeah.
It is having those associations. But, for instance, with PSYOP, right, you can only be a member if you are, specifically
Yeah.
practicing IO psychologist. Whereas, like, for instance, I lead a change management association, and I mean, I do lead change in a lot of ways, but like, my title isn't in change management, and I actually joined when I had a role that, like didn't kind of neatly fit into that, or even with my HR roles, right? But how do we kind of pull a little bit from each place to help improve each other? So I would love to see more associations really kind of being at the forefront of, why aren't these different associations at each other's conferences? Right, to
Mm-hmm.
like,
Yep.
kind of talk about the bridge between them. And maybe there are. So again, don't at me, people, if that exists
Yeah. Yeah.
already. But I do think there is kind of more of that democracy of, knowledge and, kind of understanding how do these different things come together, that would help everyone,
Yep.
because people are just doing the best they can in a lot of ways. I've seen a lot of HR leaders who are, it is, if they can just put out the fires that
Yeah.
come up every single day, you know what I mean? Like that's kind of like they're at capacity. So let's make things a little bit easier for people instead of kind of
Yeah.
complaining about people not using these principles. Like, what are ways we can meet people where they're at?
Gotcha. Yeah, no, and that makes sense. So essentially using the right framework or the right approach dependent on the either the problem or the context that you're trying
Yeah.
to solve. Okay. That makes sense. So shifting gears a little bit here, going back to assessments, and I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this. I
Oh.
know some people will, before I get too deep, some people will die on this hill. They think this is the best assessment, since sliced bread. And the one I'm talking about is the MBTI. So there are individuals who, swear by this. They think this is the best assessment that's ever existed. There are individuals who think the exact opposite. So two-part question here. One is, what are your thoughts on the MBTI and who's right? You don't have to answer that second one.
Okay, so I think it's going to be pretty clear when I with my opening sentence. I consider the MBTI to be the astrology
There
of.
you go. Okay.
So as much as you believe in star sign, rising sun,
Yeah, yeah,
rising, as much as you believe that that influences how people behave in the workplace, that is the same level at which you should believe the MBTI,
yeah, yeah,
right? Like, not only does it have incredibly problematic beginnings, but it also doesn't have reliability or validity.
yeah,
So literally, I
yeah,
would just ask, like, what is your point with it? Now, I will say, could it be like a fun team building activity? Sure.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like, if you want to use it as just like a fun activity, kind of, like those quizzes, that I don't know, growing up, right? You had those like cute little like personality quizzes, whatever. Like, if you want to use it like that, sure. But it should never be used for anything that involves decisions. And I
yeah,
feel incredibly comfortable saying that. I've never once recommended it to a client. Luckily, I haven't had any clients ask me
yeah,
about it.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's got, like I said, low reliability, limited
Hmm.
validity. So those are serious psychometric
Yeah,
limitations.
yeah,
And just there's better models,
yep,
right? But even just personality testing in general, I'm always hesitant,
yeah,
right? If you're going to use a personality test at all, I truly believe it should be for more team dynamics,
hmm,
right? Like after
yeah,
you've already kind of selected someone for the role, like so team dynamics development. I'm not saying it's never, especially the big five, right? I'm not saying it's never,
yeah,
useful. I didn't say that,
yeah,
everybody.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But it would have to be one of several things that you are doing within the interviewing process, right? And it's just like one piece of the puzzle. Because just personality in general, like I hate, for instance, the fact that like, oh, well, all this research shows that, extroversion,
yeah,
that's correlated with leadership. It's like, well, okay,
yeah,
let's think about like, that correlation there, right?
hmm,
So how are we thinking about like what are the measures used for that leadership effectiveness?
yeah,
are we considering the fact that so often our brains have an idea of what a leader should look and sound like,
Hmm.
right? So even if you have the team kind of do an assessment, there can also be bias there with saying, because they're so confident in the way they talk, it's like, oh, they must know what they're talking about. They must be a great
Yeah.
leader, right? But just extroverts just they're just usually confident talkers, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't mean
Yeah.
that they necessarily know exactly what they're talking about. And I just hate the way that, it really makes introverted people feel, whether consciously or subconsciously, oh, I could never be a leader, right? Whether they know those results or not, it's inundated in their head throughout their entire kind of career that like they couldn't be a good leader when actually introverted people can be some of the best leaders. They're
Hmm.
generally incredible listeners,
Yeah.
right? They have kind of unique ideas. They actually think before they speak, right? Which
Yeah.
I think is a
Yeah.
great skill to have. So I think it's always on the organization to say, how could we make anyone here a leader?
Yeah.
Right? Like
100.
not
Yeah.
like excluding based on personality, but actually thinking no matter what their personality is, how could we get them there? And our personality testing is only just to like serve that development.
Yeah, and I agree with you, it's funny how much we do agree. And so for me, when it comes to your point, leaders often there's the maybe false conclusion that they tend to be more extroverted. I like to remind individuals that even today's leaders, they're pretty different. Two groups or a couple of individuals I like to contrast with each other is think of the Elon Musk and the Steve Jobs. They're traditionally we would think of as the more extroverted, the more outgoing, the more kind of in your face, rough around the edges. But then I contrast that with the Warren Buffetts, the Richard Bransons, a little bit more soft-spoken, not as out there, more reserved. But when we take a step back and look at both of their performances, or all four organizations, their performance, they're all doing pretty good. Whether, it's the Elon Musk group, or whether it's Apple, whether it's, the Virgin Group, or, Berkshire Hathaway, they're all doing pretty good and they all approach it a little bit differently. So I agree 10,000% that at the end of the day, it should be based on performance. I lean more towards competencies rather than personality. I lean more towards outcomes rather than personality. So I agree with everything that you're sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. And just because they're extroverted doesn't mean they're going to be a great leader, right?
There you go.
Like
Yeah,
it
yeah.
goes all around. Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so speaking of the MBTI, did you have a chance to view the documentary called Persona on HBO by any chance? And if so, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as someone might guess from our conversation, right? Absolutely raised really important parts, really
Hmm.
important points.
Yeah,
Particularly around really the misuse
yeah, yeah.
of personality testing, right? So again, no one here is saying throw it all away. But because they've been misused so often, there's a reason why they have a bad rap, right? Like, and then when I think about bias, they brought up a really great point around people with disabilities. When you think about neurodivergence, right? Like, how does that, kind of filter out people who could actually be really incredible in that role, but there's something about, or like, that test related anxiety, whatever it is, right? Or even just kind of not taking it in the manner that it should be. I mean, if you're trying to get a job, of course you're going to be thinking like, what are they looking for,
Yeah,
right? Or
yeah,
even like I told you that example of like, even with all that I know, like I fall in the trap. I'm taking the assessment. I'm like, well, they're not going to really
yeah, yeah,
believe, in
yeah,
that instance, I wasn't taking it for a job or anything, but I still was like, they're not going to actually believe that, like,
yeah,
like I need to maybe like make myself like not look so good. So, so
yeah.
it's just there's a lot of factors, and so it's just scary if that's used as a step in the process, right? So a company might say, oh, but we use all these things, but if that initial step includes a personality test, well, you're not filtering out the right things, right? So kind of making sure you are using it in an appropriate manner, and that's where if you are going to use an assessment, no assessment should be approved without a conversation with someone trained in IO psychology, right? Like helping you really understand like this is the right choice, you're
Hmm.
using it for the right reasons, you know what to do with it after you use it, right?
Yeah,
Because even if it is in the selection process, like it still should be something for development, right? Like it
yeah,
should never be kind of a we're going to throw that away now. And And I think also it is just helpful to kind of see over time, even doing a gut check for the organization, like, hey, we keep having these same issues. Let's take a look at the
Yeah.
profiles of, you know what I mean, of who
Yeah.
we're, is there something here that maybe we're missing? So yeah, so it's just, it's really
Yeah.
boils down to with persona. I mean, there wasn't anything that I necessarily totally disagreed with. It's just any tool is only as good as how you use it.
Yeah.
So
100%.
just, so that should be the takeaway versus, like I said, throwing everything away.
Yeah, and as you were sharing your example, it reminded me of so when it comes to self-assessments, and I know we agree that may not always be the best, but for me, I this might be, the contrarian in me. I always see if I can break it. So what I mean by
Oh
that
yeah.
is I will only answer in the extremes just to see what happens. To see,
Yeah.
okay, David is either a psychopath or he is a genius. Nothing in between. So it's like, okay, I always do it just to see what happens. And
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah.
Even going back through the questions, it's like, okay, if I
Yeah,
answer this one this way,
yeah,
are
yeah, yeah,
they gonna
yeah.
like flag me that like I must be full of crap because I answer
Yeah.
this other one that way? That's yeah, I mean that's how my brain works too. So I
Yeah,
totally
just to
get
see what
that.
happens. Perfect. All right, Alex. So we definitely went over a lot. We talked about kind of big IO, different areas within it. Is there anything else that we haven't touched upon that you wanted to be sure we ironed out?
No, I mean, I think this is a really good conversation. I really hope everybody is having, I really hope there
Yeah,
are more conversations like this out there. My hope is that this is not unique,
yeah,
right? Though if you are hearing some of these things for the first time, for anyone listening, like please like have those conversations, right? Do the
yeah.
back and forth, challenge yourself, challenge others. And again, it goes both on both sides of both the business and the academic side. And, like every field, we should all be continuously learning and adapting. And I welcome anyone to, reach out and challenge me as well. I've had such great learnings from dealing with clients who aren't versed in IO psychology, right? Who kind of don't come from this world and really just everything's about value creation. And it doesn't mean they're not interested in better cultures, but if we don't get better on articulating how it
Mhm.
all translates, that's why we're at where we're at. We can't blame it all on these, money hungry business leaders, so to speak,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It really is how are we properly articulating why this all matters in the grand scheme of things.
yeah, 100%. And if people wanted to connect with you to find out more or potentially challenge some of your ideas, where would you
Yeah.
recommend they go?
So please, you can go to my LinkedIn under Alexandra Prassas. Happy to connect, have conversations. Yeah, I'm always up for these types of dialogues for sure.
Perfect. All right, Alex. Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much. And until next time.
Thank you.